Okay, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see you all here in this beautiful beginning of fall day here in Princeton, and we are delighted and honored to have Tasso Azevedo back to Princeton and to have Marina Hirota with us this week as well, engaging various activities. So our event today is called Climate Change and Brazil's Conservation Frontiers. And Tasso Azevedo, he has been at the very beginning of the Brazil Lab, when we didn't know what the Brazil Lab would become, but we knew that we wanted to target one of the major issues of our times, which is the planetary crisis, and we knew that Amazonia was a vital planetary nexus. And in our first conversations, plotting ideas, scholars, contributors, co-conspirators, we were immediately said, anything with Amazonia, Tasso Azevedo. He is the person you have to reach out. So we contacted him a few weeks later. He was here, and the rest is history. So Tasso has been playing a seminal role in the Brazil Lab, but most importantly, in conversations in Brazil and across the globe on major issues related to deforestation, conservation, environmental justice. And we are so proud, Tasso. I know you're humble of the work that you have been doing over the years. You are really an inspiration, to all of us, across the planet, the ways you engage with the real issues of our times, the way you deploy technology, and how you envision things from a perspective of changing what we deem as possible. So this blend of vision and doability and doing it differently, doing it towards a vision of preservation, conservation is just tremendous. So Tasso has many, many accolades. He won many international prizes and recognition, Scholar Award, etc., etc., etc. And Tasso is now playing a very important role in Brazil currently, just as he played a few administrations ago, right, when he played a seminal role in the design and implementation of the national plan to combat deforestation, but also the Amazon Fund. He will tell us a little bit where things are today in terms of climate change and also the politics of fighting climate change, fighting deforestation, but also envisioning, hopefully, a greener Brazil with a major role as a kind of a green power with a planetary force as well. Tasso is the director of Mapiomas. Many of you have worked with the materials, the maps, the knowledge, the databases that Mapioma has used. And we are proud to have Tasso here every year teaching our students, both in courses, but also during winter session, bringing colleagues and making available, open system, making it available to the broader public, scholars all over the world, this incredibly rich, sharp, edgy kind of historical knowledge on land use and much more, fireways, wireways, et cetera, et cetera. So I will stop talking, but just to say, Tasso, we really treasure immensely the work you do and your contributions, to Brazil, the planet, and to the Brazil Lab, and the little we can do to advance the cause of conservation. And also we have our wonderful Marina Hirota back to Princeton. She has been a great partner of the Brazil Lab. She's one of Brazil's most eminent, woman scientists who is making a big difference in understanding, from tipping points, resilience, and she's an innovative thinker in her own way. She has had several prestigious grants in Brazil, including from Serra Pilheira, and she's a professor of meteorology at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, UFSC, as the Cariocas call it, as Southern fellows would call it UFSC. But Marina has also been a wonderful contributor to an initiative that we're developing at the lab, which is funded by the Dean of Research and the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies and the Department of Anthropology on engaging indigenous ecologies of knowledges. And we have Carol Levis with us here too. That's a participant of this research group. And we are here, Marina is helping us this week together with Carol and other fellows to advance a project on indigenous practices and ideas and concepts of conservations for Science magazine. So it's a wonderful project. Hopefully we'll make some dents in analytical thinking on that frontier. So I'm talking too much. I want to thank you all who made this event possible, the staff, the postdoctoral fellows, and again, thank you all for your participation, and let's give Tasso our warmest welcome back to Princeton.
Thank you, João. And Marina now is not in on the scientific committee of Mapioma. It's kind of boss. Yeah, so as usually, I never prepare presentations much in advance because things are always moving, right? So this comes from the last 3 hours, so kind of putting things together and some ideas after a conversation with Marina. And so let's see how it goes. But the basic thing that I will pass in this half an hour or so is we are having like this extreme events in Brazil. Now it's became something common to have extreme events, some kind of a strange thing. And so I want to make a connection with things that may be driving this and what we can influence or not in what this is driving and what's happening now in Brazil in relation to those areas that we could move a little bit. So I would do this in a way that we're just jumping between tons of things and then leave space for us to kind of discuss a little bit. As things are evolving in Brazil every day now, so every day there's something new happening in various fronts. So we can exchange some ideas about that. So it's escalating, right? João was here, right, in this place 2 weeks before the floods in Rio Grande do Sul.
And I, that region.
Yeah, one of my, I didn't know that you had family there, but one of my, one of our colleagues that coordinate the, ironically, the mapping of water in Brazil, his family was one of the families that lost everything, like the house and etc. They were rescued from the roof of the house. So it's basically cyclone, something that we didn't have 10 years ago. This was not a reality in Brazil. And then we had now 5 registered on the last 10 years, like 5 events of those. It was not common. We have those, another strange thing, like the first time I saw this image, when it happens on a Saturday, I thought that this was a kind of a joke. Image from Africa. Somebody was kind of playing with that. But it happens to be in Franca. And I have a friend that lived there, and she said, look, it's the church of the city. That's really Franca. So that's a sandstorm in São Paulo. We had this, the first time we saw this, like this size was in 2020 and 21. And this year, it was not in the news because of the floods in Rio Grande do Sul, but actually we had the same events the last 2 weeks happening in the interior of São Paulo. So you had this big floods in Rio Grande do Sul, and then we have sandstorms in São Paulo, which is related to a drought. Then we have the droughts and the fire in Pantanal. Most of you saw these things happening in the last 2 years. Last year actually was much less strong, but still we had a big drought in Pantanal, but we have also wet season. But like 20 and 21 was a disaster, like what we saw in Pantanal. I think this is even for me, it's even kind of even more crazy than see the things happen in Pantanal. This is in the Amazon last week in Tefé, and this river is about like 2 kilometers wide, and but there's no water. Like it's not that you can navigate. There's simply no water. Like this is all sand banks, right? So it's really striking all these extremes. And this is today. That's today in Brazil. Like we are having, we're talking about like 44, 45 degrees Celsius. Not in one place, but in several places in Brazil.
That would be over 100. It would be 110 or 111. Yes.
Yeah. So
Fahrenheit. Yeah.
really I don't remember having something like that in this time of the year. It's really rare. Very dry, and we will have heavy rains on the south on the weekend. Like that's how things are progressing there. This graph on the right side is the deviation from the average rainfall in the different regions of Brazil year by year since 62 to 2020. Basically, like the message here is after the year 2000, if you cut here, basically everywhere except on the south where we have the floods, it's getting drier. So we have less rain year after year and month after month. Actually, this graphic is showing all the months also. So it's kind of it's not something that you see and look at, oh, this is like just a deviation for some years. It's actually consistently getting less rain in general. So what are the three forces that is actually acting at the same time for having this extreme events? So it's basically three things. Part of that is the natural events that happens in cycles. For example, El Nino. So this year is the first year of El Nino. The second year tends to be the worst one. So the worst is still to come. Like it will be next year. Yeah? So that's a recurring event. It's happening there. It was there, for decades and decades. We know about that, but not so strong as this time. The second is climate change. So there is, or as we say, global warming, but basically emissions change on the amount of energy that we have on the atmosphere, and we are changing the regions forcing. It's like that in English. Forçamento radioativo.
Driving.
Yeah. Regions forcing. I don't know. Like in English, how is the term the right term? But basically the amount of energy that we trap in the planet. And then we have land use and land use change, which has particular implications for ourselves as we are in Brazil because of the circulation of the water and air, etc. So these are the three forces are moving around. We basically can't do much on the first one, right? This was there, that's already happening. There is it's part of the cycles of the planet, but we can actually move something on the other two. So I will concentrate on those other two because this is like where we can have some action. And maybe because of those interactions, if we can move the needle on those two, maybe it will kind of decrease the intensity of the first one, right? So on climate change, like, what is our take on this? Like, Brazil is the 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter, just after Russia, US, India, and China. Well, I think that was the first one. If we group European Union, then it will be like Brazil will be the 5th, the 6th. But it's like the 5th largest emitter, and the reason why we are there is because of land use. So in the 4 countries that are the biggest emitters, about 3/4 of the emissions are burning fossil fuels. That's the main problem. In our case, we are in this list because of what we have in emissions on land use change, which includes, for example, deforestation, which is about half of our emissions, and another quarter of our emissions that is from agriculture. It's basically cattle, using of fertilizers, emissions from soils, and so on. So basically 3/4 of our emissions is related to land use, the way we use the land. And interestingly, if you take now the emissions from land, from land use, then we are saying that Brazil would be like between 20 and 25th emitter. And so why? Because we are pretty good actually on the energy side, right? A lot of renewables and so on and so on. Yeah, so, and this is the trajectory of our emissions over the time. The highest level we had was in 2000, this is like 2023, it's basically the year that we have more emissions. Then we have a big drop on the emissions because of when the first time the deforestation comes down. And then as deforestation comes up and also the other sectors was coming up, our emissions was growing. And in 2021, this the last data available, we come back to close to 2.2 million, 2.2 gigatons of emissions, which is the second, the largest value that we have since 2006. So we're actually going in the kind of a opposite direction that we should be. Interestingly, also, every country present goals and commitments into reducing their emissions in 2015. Like everybody has their NDCs, and since 2015, our emissions, instead of going down, it's actually going up. That's our trend since then, right? And this is mainly related to land use. If you actually take it out, the green part of this graph and the yellow part of this graph, you will see that the emissions since 2010, it's basically stable. So the emissions from the industry and energy is basically stable. It's not changing much, right? So it's all about the understanding of land use. And that's something that I have been dedicating a lot of time in the last 8 years, is to really kind of understanding how things are happening on the land use. So we can, by doing that, we can have policies that, incentivize the reduction of emissions by doing activities that have less emissions and increasing activities that, increase the carbon removals of the atmosphere, right? So, why this matters? Because what happened on the land use, it's very significant to the flow, especially of water in Brazil. And Marina knows all about that, so I will not try to explain the whole thing, because then she will come to the scientific committee and say that I said something that was not accurate, because I don't understand. But basically, the Amazon is bombing water that comes to the rest of the continent and to the south of Brazil. Actually, this point here is Franca, where I show this sandstorm, right? So if this is the forest bombing the water, if you decrease the amount of forest, you decrease the bomb, and so you have less force bringing the water down. So the decisions we take on how we use the land will impact what we can actually do in terms of the protection of ourselves in Brazil, and also as a consequence, as a side effect, also what happens in Argentina, what happens in Paraguay, what happens in south of Bolivia, and even Uruguay, right, is impacted by the decisions we take in Brazil of how we do land use. So we have this platform, Mapiomas, where we manage, we kind of monitor the land use change. In a nutshell, we basically make one map for every year since '85, and this map has the land use land cover and land use of the country on a pixel by pixel basis, and then you can tell the story of each one of those pixels. So we divide the country in 9.6 billion pieces, and each one of those pieces we tell the story, pixel by pixel. So you can really actually click on any place on the map, and we'll tell the story of that specific piece. That's the concept. So, for example, this piece, I just click there somewhere close to the Xingu, which is the indigenous reserve here. So I could just click on a farm there. So that pixel was a forest in 85. In 93, it was converted to pasture. The yellow is pasture. And then it stays as a pasture until 2013. And then in 2014, it was transformed into agriculture. And then next year, we could see that it was soybean, and it has been soybean since ever. So this is like a pixel by pixel. So another interesting information here is that we had a fire. And it's not a coincidence that we have a fire just after we have the deforestation. That's the dynamics. Like you clear cut the forest, and then you use the fire to finish the job. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have really fire in the forest unless somebody put fire or something around that escaped to the forest, right? Anyway, so now because we have the story of each one of those pixels, then you can have the story of any part of the country to understand what's going on. So if you summarize this and simplify a lot, taking all the classes that are natural and group in one place, and then you group all the classes that are anthropic use, and then we have those two classes in the map. What we see in terms of the history from 86 to 85 to 2020 in this case here, although there is data until 2022 now, is that we lose 82 million hectares of natural ecosystems in Brazil that were converted in anthropic use. California is 42 million hectares, so it's about 2 Californias, like more or less. Like so, it's a big area just in this amount of time. So yeah, so big transformation. And then the interesting thing is to understand what is transforming into what, right? So basically, everything you lose in terms of native vegetation, so the dark green is forest, the light, the second one here, is like kind of a savanna forest, or what they call in FAO other woodlands. And then the light one is grasslands, natural grasslands. So in all of them, we are losing area, and so you see where you're losing, and then where you are gaining area. So we are gaining area on pasture. So we increase 43 million hectares of pasture, 1 California of pasture in this period, and 1 Germany in agriculture. 36 million hectares is 1 Germany. But interestingly, the pasture land stops to grow in more or less in the year 2000. So if you see here, it's more or less stop here, and what is growing is agriculture. So the phenomenon we have now is that agriculture is growing over pasture, and pasture is growing over forest, but the result for pasture is more or less like stable, the area. Doesn't mean that we don't have deforestation for pasture. It's just that the area is staying the same, but it's gaining more area over the forest or natural land and losing area for agriculture. And then we will have the argument that, oh, agriculture is not converting natural environment, which is kind of tricky, right? But anyway, it's just to understand, if you take everything else, like if you take all the cities in Brazil, all the infrastructure, everything together, like all the roads, and it's 0.5% of the country. So it doesn't really, all mining, everything together, 0.5. If you take all water surface, about 2%. So water is 4 times what we have in, for example, in urban areas and so on. The other aspect is, so it's in Portuguese, but anyway. So the other interesting dynamic is if you make a map where what you see here in green and yellow is the areas that haven't changed since 85 to 2020. Stay basically the same class that they were in the beginning, they were at the end. Everything you see in white is the areas that actually have changed. So 77% of the country during this period haven't changed. And the rest is what actually have changed. And when we see just this area that you have changed, what you see here in yellow is the areas that change from natural to anthropic before 85. And what you see in red is what we add just between 85 and now. So let's say from the almost 300 million hectares that we have on anthropic area in Brazil, 1/3 happened on the last 38 years. Although we have over 500 years of occupation, we are just talking about like this last 30 something years that is changing. So it's a changing that is happening very fast. Sufficiently fast, then we start to see those kind of impacts that we were seeing before. So if you take just the Amazon as an example, we were having this interesting conversation in the hotel, which is, how we calculate how much we lost in terms of the Amazon, right? Here I'm just using the criteria as the biome and seeing from the native vegetation that you have originally, how much we lost until now. And it's about 20%. So it's about 20% of loss of native vegetation. And there is another 20%, which is degradation of various types of degradation. So what Carlos Nobre and Thomas Lovejoy and others were basically saying is like somewhere between 20 and 25% of loss of the forest and native vegetation in the Amazon, we may get to a tipping point where the forest is not able to recover the process by itself to maintain the process in terms of rain and so on. So we are kind of very close to testing the borders of what is the tipping point. Maybe we are in the tipping point and we don't know, because tipping point, you never know, right? You only know in the future looking back. Like 15 years from now, then we look back, oh, that was 23. And we didn't know, right? Hopefully not, but pretty close. Now, I just use this as just to make a reference that I'm not even talking about biodiversity, for example, right? But just to mention something that it's an interesting number. If there is a paper that estimate that there was 2 species that every 2 days we discover a new species in the Amazon. There was one new species described in the Amazon every 2 days in between 2014 and 15. So there is many things to discover, right? There is even an X Prize on that, right?
Yes.
That we may have the results by the end of this year. That is just about like, let's discover the things in the Amazon faster, right? But the most striking is this one information, which is there is an estimation that we are losing, only thinking about 3 species, we are losing 1 tree species get extinct in the Amazon every 2 days. So basically we are losing species faster than we discover them. So probably a lot of things in the Amazon we will not even realize and learn about them because they are just going too fast, right? So I just put this here just to remember that there is a whole other universe, which I'm not a specialist in, which is there for other things that we still have. I'm trying to imagine fungi or insects or I don't know, the whole thing that we don't see. Sorry, just a point here. Remember, I told you like this whole cycle of the water coming up, down. Most of the irrigation for Pantanal, which is the largest wetland in the planet, comes from the Amazon, right? And so that graph on the right side, it's showing the water surface in Pantanal since 85 to 2021. And so, and this is calculated month by month. So this is the annual average after you collect this information month by month since 85. So it's a drop of 65%. And even last year, which we had like a bigger increase on the water, we were still in 50% decrease on the water surface in Pantanal. It's really something, right, happening there. So I could say that if you want to tackle those two areas here, in the case of Brazil, this means do one single thing, a group of things, to actually tackle that, which is eliminate deforestation in one side and regenerate vegetation and soil everywhere. And I include both, like native vegetation and soil, because it's, you regenerate native vegetation on areas that you want to be restored as forests. But in all the land that is dedicated to agriculture, you can also do a regeneration using the soil as a sink of carbon. Most of agricultural soils, they are actually a source of emissions from the carbon soils because of the way you manage. But you can actually convert this to all this agricultural land to keep as agricultural land, but actually sink in carbon. So there's many ways in which you can do this, not rocket science. But so the idea is like, if we can manage this, to do this in Brazil, then we can transform this, this three forces in this decisive way. So one example of this is that. So this is the, when you plot the data on emissions and removals from the land used in Brazil, you will see here on the top is the emissions that comes from land use change, from burning of fossil residues, and loss of our carbon or organic carbon in soils. These are the three components of the emissions. Most of that is land use change due to deforestation. But this is like 1 gigapoint, 188 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. But then there is a sinking that is already happening, right? And I'm counting here the sinking of carbon in protected areas, which is just part of the forest in Brazil. But this is like because of the accounting system of the national inventories. So you just account for the areas that are, you just account for the sinking on native vegetation that is under specific protection, like a protected area, like a conservation unit, something like this. It's just a rule of accounting. But even just accounting for this part and accounting for the secondary vegetation, which is the forest that is regrowing, and due to land use change also, then we had 667 million tons of CO2 equivalent of sinking. Now, simply put it, like if we zero deforestation in Brazil today, we go from a 521 million tons of CO2 net emissions to 667 million tons of removal. Is that big, the difference? Like it's like 1 gigaton that you just strip from the emissions directly. So yeah. Now the interesting thing is that we have much more regeneration than what we expected or than what we think. So you might maybe revising some documents about the commitments of Brazil, you might have been heard about this number 12 million hectares of restoration as a kind of a goal. So when Brazil present this goal, like we want to restore 12 million hectares. This promise was done in 2015 to be completed in 2030, right? But in 2015, we didn't have this information that we have now. And now we know that we have in Brazil 48 million hectares of, 48 million hectares of restoration already. Which is, now we know that how many Californias are this? It's 1 California plus New Jersey. Right? So it's an immense area that is actually in regeneration. Which you see here, like this is like around rivers and so on in São Paulo. But the interesting thing about this thing that is regrowing in Brazil is that it seems like a good news, right? Wow, we have this amount of regeneration. 10% of all native vegetation in Brazil is actually things that are regenerating. But actually, not that much. That's basically abandoned areas. It's so degraded that you abandon because it's not productive, and then you abandon, and this is starting to regrow. So it's not a virtual cycle like, okay, we want to proactively, engage on restoration, etc. It's just that because you abandon and this thing is regrowing, right? But interestingly, when you look to deforestation and you separate, and we do this in Mapiomas, we can see that the deforestation of primary vegetation and the deforestation of secondary vegetation, we see that almost like 50% of the total deforestation that we have in the country today is actually secondary vegetation. But the secondary vegetation is only 10% of our forests. So basically, the velocity in which we clear cut the regeneration, it's 10 times faster than what happens in the primary vegetation. So it's kind of crazy, right? You have a target of restoring 12 million hectares. Everybody talking about like creating companies and talking about planting new trees and etc. And actually, we are just cutting down the regeneration, 10 times faster than we are doing in primary forest. So this is a type of thing that we have to kind of realize how to work. In the Amazon, it's less. The proportion is 1/3, but it's this proportion it's higher, for example, in the Atlantic rainforest and so on. The other thing that we know, and it's also in the package, is the fact that land use means a lot in terms of what you have in conservation. So this is today actually we had on the newspaper in Brazil, Folha de São Paulo, a similar analysis, doing with a different area, but it's very similar. But basically, it's like if you take the areas that are indigenous lands, they lost only 1%. They have just 1% of deforestation. And if you take the private lands, they have 20.6% of deforestation in this period of 85 to 2020, 21 in this case. So what it means that although, for example, in the Amazon, the indigenous lands and other areas occupied by what we call forest people represents 1/3 of the land, of the territory, only 1% of the deforestation that happens in this period happens on those lands. So this is by far the most protected areas that we have, even more protected than the conservation units, right? Actually, you can see this here. Yeah. So then we have some present news about the things that are happening right now. This is the deforestation detected by DETER, which is one of the systems that we have to detect deforestation that detects on almost real time. It's not the final number for the deforestation annually, but it's a very good indicator of what's going on with deforestation. So these are the numbers from January to August, year by year, since 2015. And so we saw that in 2023, we are now currently on a drop of 48% of deforestation this year, if you compare with last year, which is a big thing. It's basically cutting by half the deforestation from last year to this year. Just this drop is equivalent to 200 million tons of CO2 less emissions, which is the total emissions of Peru. Peru, for example. Then you can see some of the things that you see like clearly have an impact. So the red line is the deforestation in square kilometers year by year since 2019. And then the blue line is the penalties, fines given to illegal deforestation. The brown is embargo, which is like you lock the property for production because of illegal activities. And dark blue is auto de inflação. What is auto de inflação? Lawyers, I don't know.
It's like a fine that can become like a legal.
It's before the fine, right? The fine is this one, is the amount of money. Yeah, the light blue is the amount of money that they put in fines, and the dark blue will be like the administrative process of that. So it's very simple, right? You see, like if you enforce, you can see the start of decreasing of deforestation. So since in the last 4 years, that was not the priority, do those things, and then suddenly you just shift the way you do things, like just put a more emphasis, and you start to see the move. Now, so this here is kind of basically the 7 things you need to do if you want to drop down deforestation and increase restoration on an easy way. We know this for 15 years now. Basically, there's no rocket science. It's just basically 7 simple things that not simple, but let's say direct things. It's not like a magic that we need to do some research specific. It's like 1, enforcement of to make illegal activities a bad business. So the idea is, like, you can't chase everyone that is doing something illegal. The same way you can't stop the traffic light and stay there to catch every car that tries to pass to the red light, right? You don't do that. You put a radar, and then in some of the crossings, and then you know that you may cross, and then you take a picture, and somehow this will come to your home one day. Could be tomorrow, could be in 1 week, could be in 3 months, but you know that for sure there will be this ticket and you have to pay a fine, right? That's what this incentive. So strategic enforcement means this, like you create you create the perception that there will be consequence if you make deforestation. And that's something that I forgot to show here, is like we calculate the amount of potential illegality of deforestation in Brazil, doing a report of every single deforestation that happens in the last 4 years. And the level of, let's say, deforestation with elements of, I'll say this like, elements that could give you an idea that this is like, or evidence of illegality is well over 95%. Like in some certain cases, 99%, 98%. So at least one evidence of illegality. So if you want to fight something that is legal, you have to make it, or you have to transform the perception in a perception that this is a bad business. And how we do that? Like, we show that enforcement will be there. We show that it may take time, but you will get a fine when in the mail, or I can lock your property, or you can't get finance from the bank and things like this, right? So block financial flows of illegal activities is absolutely crucial. On the last 12 months, the major banks in Brazil giving credit just by using one of the tools that we make available for mapiomas, that Banco do Brasil, BNDES, Caixa Econômica Federal, Santander, they blocked 11,000 requests for rural credit or agricultural credit, which is above $1 billion of money that didn't come to the credit because they were blocked because of the deforestation. So this gives like a clear sign, okay, how I can lose the credit, or I can lose the market, or et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is very crucial, as we saw, like the land tenure means a lot. So if you see in this graph, the amount of deforestation on public land that is not designated, so that it's not defined if it's a protected area or not, it's much higher than when you designate as a protected area or a conservation unit. So it's very important to define what's the use of this public land. It's what we call designation of public forests. We have about 70 million hectares. 70 million hectares is in our coin, California, is 1.5 California, of land that is not assigned. So there's no use defined, right? So we used to say that this is the largest piece of land under dispute in the planet today. It's under dispute, like people are disputing the use of this land, although supposedly it belongs to all of us as public land. Consolidate protected areas and indigenous lands, that's absolutely crucial. We know that if you create and protect and create the conditions for protection of those lands, it's a very easy way to protect not easy, but cheap way to protect the forest, because the people that are protecting the forest are there and nobody's paying for that, right? It's just they're doing that because they need it. Economic incentives for conservation and private and public lands. There's several ideas now being designed to thinking about a mechanism to pay for environmental services, but without thinking about all this complicated thing of measuring how much the environmental services are, which is useless. So we're thinking, there's a lot of thinking now on a kind of a global mechanism to pay for maintaining the forest. And we can discuss a little bit more about that. The shift for what we call green infrastructure. A lot of the pressures over the forest comes from the development of infrastructure. The infrastructure can drive deforestation or can drive conservation, depends on how you design it. So this is something that is coming strongly. Hopefully will come strong on the green development plan that is in designing right now. And support sustainable activities in rural property, settlements, and community land. This part is very important because there's no vacuum on economy, right? So if you take out a illegal activity or something that you don't want to have economically, you have to substitute with something else. Otherwise, this activity will just come back, right? So now finish with this. I think what we are living now, the moment that we are living now in Brazil, there's too many things happening at the same time, but it's basically, we are shifting from like, as we were like 4 years, the last 4 years, they came here just to say, oh, yeah, fighting, swimming with sharks in a storm. And now we're kind of surfing the wave. So the things are aligned to be in the same direction. So when you're surfing, you drop down, you fail and etc. But at least you're going into a safe direction, right? That's the idea. So some good things that are happening, all of them is kind of progressing in different formats, but we have this very, very interesting dynamic of what we call the ecological transition plan. And it's funny because the name ecological transition was proposed by the Minister of Finance, not the Minister of Environment, which is kind of interesting. So, you see like this week, Haddad and Marina are, floating around this climate week, talking about that. They're taking this very seriously. Actually, who is coordinating the plan is actually the Minister of Finance, which is very important. So they are the ones pushing that with the involvement of all the others, seeing this as an opportunity there. The PPCDAN is the plan to combat deforestation that we start back in 2005, and now it's coming back, running live. It's full speed in the Amazon. Still being implemented on the other biomes, but it's there. We came back, like we passed 4 years. Was the first time in history that we passed 4 years since the 40s. Wait a minute. Since the 40s, was the first time we spent more than 1 year without having a single protected area created at the federal level in Brazil or indigenous lands demarcated. So this was like, imagine, it's like there were tons of processes stopped. Process, we say like processos?
Lawsuits.
Yeah, like the documentation. Yeah, waiting for having like the decision. And now it's started to come back and to come out. So we had like the first half of the year, we have the first protected areas, the first indigenous lands recognized, and it's coming. There's another thing that's kind of a crazy, but we didn't have basically no regulation on gold mining. So you basically show up in São Paulo with a piece of gold, and then you go to a CVM, and one of those DVTs, and say, oh, this gold comes from this place, done. And you invent a legal gold in the market on paper. That was until, some weeks ago. So now it's coming to have this kind of this notion of, know the source and tracing back the origins of gold. So it's kind of starting to regulate that. A lot of destruction of garimpos in illegal places happening. There is a whole new set of regulations to shift the way we do credit in agriculture that is coming in pieces. So you see this moving on the next 4 years slowly. The vision is, if you are getting credit that is subsidized, which basically that's what we have in Brazil, is like basically all the banks give loans for agriculture, and they receive part of the interest rate is paid by the treasury. So you give a discount to the producer. So the producer will get, like, for example, the loans for 7% a year. Yeah, it's high in US, but it's not in Brazil. And the difference from the 13% that we have on the national interest rate, this difference is equalized and paid by the treasury. So there's a lot of investment from public money in Brazil to actually subsidize the money for agriculture, which happens everywhere in the world. But the idea is, if we are subsidizing this with public money, we should have rules that is on the public interest, right? So I will not give you money subsidized if you're not doing something that is on the public interest. And so this notion of what is the public interest, the last years or historically has been like, oh, we are producing food, and food is very important for everybody. So it's kind of food for everyone. And now we're saying like, okay, that's important, but it's more than that. Like we have to take care of the environment that is also very important for all of us. So now there will be rules. For example, if you want to get credit for pasture land, you should show that you are applying the best practices. So your pasture is not emitting carbon, it's actually sinking carbon. So there is a whole idea of how to do this in 4 years. So by the end of the 4th year, there should be no credit for anyone that is trying to make pasture on the traditional way without, for example, shifting your practices for the best practice. Well, at least that's the aim. The aim is to have this move. And we have just the new bill on the carbon credits that's coming. Very interesting. The most important part, I think, on this piece of legislation and the innovation is that it involves a cap and trade system for the whole economy. So it means like any sector could be regulated by this carbon market in Brazil. For those that don't follow this discussion much, like basically carbon markets, they work for stationary emissions. So it's like the industry, a big power plant and things like this. So it's basically say, look, this place is very simple to account for how much is the emissions. So you put a cap, and then you say if you emit more than the cap, then you have to buy credits from somebody else. If you emit less than your cap, you have some credits that you can sell to somebody else. And then you allow for some portion of what you can compensate with projects that come from outside the market that is kept, right? But this works when you have 75% of your emissions coming from fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels. In the case of Brazil, it makes no sense that you don't regulate actually the rural sector. And that's actually the fight now in Brazil that you will see. Like people on rural sector, they don't want to be kept. They don't want to be regulated, but they want to sell credits if they have it, which makes no sense. So that will be but this is the big innovation, that is all sectors could be regulated. But there is some contradictions also happening, right? So we just recently, like 2 weeks ago, we have the launching of this energy transition plan for Brazil. And then if you look at really what is written there, the amount of money that is there, about 60% or even more, depending on how you calculate it, of this money is to invest on oil, right? I like the explanation why you have to invest on oil, because you need the money from oil to actually promote the transition. So my understanding of this is basically like this. You go to the doctor, right? You are feeling bad, and then the doctor said, oh, you have a breast cancer. So you instead of saying to you, like, you should quit smoking, he says, like, you should smoke more, because with the taxes from smoke, you have more money to the health system, and so you will have a good health system to treat your cancer. That's more or less like my take on this. So it's like, it's kind of a strange logic. But anyway, that's the argument. The argument, oh, we need the money from oil to do so. And there is this whole debate about oil in the Amazon, even if it's in the coast and the sea, it's a debate. And that's particularly important that deforestation is actually increasing in Cerrados. So it's going down very fast in the Amazon, but it's going up on Cerrados. There is many things that are playing on this, but it's basically all the eyes are in the Amazon, and the eyes on Cerrado is more or less like, oh, it's acceptable. It's acceptable in Cerrado, and then you can have like legal deforestation can be obtained in Cerrado. The legislation in Europe that is talking about like the zero deforestation, it don't apply for 60% of the Cerrado, because it's not like on the definition of the forest. So basically the pressure is going there by now. So it's something that we have to pay attention to if we want to be serious with this region also. So I'll stop here, and then we can go for the conversation.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
So I want to start thanking João, Miqueas, but also Fabio and Rodrigo for providing me a wonderful time here as usual. So it's great. And it's great to participate here with Tasso again. It's always a big challenge to me to speak after him, because I'm a huge fan of his way of presenting, and very spontaneous, and I really like it. This is a big challenge, but still, I was wondering, and I have a few questions and bullet points, I would say, just from the scientific perspective. So when you have the 7 bullet points here, Tasso, and you talk about the Cerrado, and I want to just show people where the Cerrado is, because I'm not sure everybody knows. Does everybody know where the Cerrado is in Brazil? Because the Amazon, yes, right? Is there anybody who doesn't know? Yeah, thank you. So the Cerrado is like in the border of the Amazon here, and there's the northern part, and then it goes wider here, like this. See? So it's quite important for the Amazon. And giving the Cerrado away because of the Amazon protection is something that we really have to take care and really have to pay attention to, I would say. But the 7 bullet points, Tasso, you mentioned, and you said that we know this a few years already. So what is the role of science to really help the government in this ecological transition plan? I would say I cannot really see that, and I don't really see the penetration of scientists in the government right now, even though we are surfing in the wave now, right? We have the chance, but I don't know how to gain momentum on this and to really be effective and collective in providing information for the Brazilian government. I don't see like doors open to do that. And I know that you've been doing this a lot, even though you say you're not a scientist. But you've been doing this a lot. How can we collectively, as like Earth system scientists, can help the government to move forward beyond the 7 bullet points? So this would be one. And the second thing is related to the tipping point, just because I really work with this, right? So you presented something here. I'm not sure I'm going to find this here, but it's like related to degradation. Where is it? And
Oh, it's just after.
yeah, it's like 20% degraded. Yeah, and 20% deforested. So we cannot really linearly add this. Yeah, but we cannot really linearly add this because degradation is part of, involves deforestation. But then, roughly, I would say 20 degradation plus 10 deforestation. And then we would have 30. And 30 is way beyond 25% that is depicted as a threshold for a systemic collapse in the Amazon. This is what we have today. This is one of the tipping points. It has been one of the foundation to claim and protect the Amazon, right? And we cannot really see a systemic collapse yet, right? And why is that? Why do you think is that? Because I have my personal opinion, but it's pretty resilient. The forest is still pretty resilient. And what is going on? Do we understand the mechanisms behind a systemic collapse in the Amazon? And then I will leave you with that because Ron said just a few minutes, right? So.
But then we'll come back to you to think
Okay.
what you think about
but I just want to drop this for starters, so for us to start discussing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you. We open to. Do you want to respond to those two questions, and then we'll open one round?
Okay. Yeah. So I think on the role of science, I think maybe it's what we have today is not the channels in which someone that wants to collaborate with the science and the government is not clear. That I think it's the case. The problem is like, okay, if you have something you want to tell, what's the channel? I think that would be the point today. But in terms of looking to the science to take decisions, that's something that is totally there right now. So like, for example, I would say first, in every single place where decisions are making, you have someone that is really well connected with the science part. So for example, let's say we have this Secretary of Combating Deforestation, right? The secretary is André Lima, which is more like a policy guy and et cetera. The guy that's seen he's like sitting down with everywhere is Rajão, which is very much in the science. It's like, actually it's almost boring sometimes, but it's like drinking all tons of every single conversation. There is like a booklet of information, citations, and so on and so on. So I think, but I agree, and that's actually a good point for making to the teams there. Say, look, you have to have a very clear venue to anyone that wants to bring information to help on the decision. They know where to go, like where you call, to whom you send your email, things like this on the different areas. Not just like I'm just giving the example on the. But I would think about the same as, for example, the Secretary of Climate Change is the same thing. Like you have André, which is the science guy in the side of the ministry and so on. So anyway, good point. So I think like, I don't think we need a point which says like, oh, we need to have the science, etc. Because the science should be everywhere, right? So it should be there. But we need a venue, very clear venue for that. That's for sure, quite clearly. Point taken. So about the tipping point, yeah, I would say, well, if it's even worse, right? Because it's 20% deforestation, 20% degradation, that would make 40%, right?
If we add linearly, yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But we cannot. But yeah.
But let's say we have something like this. So I would say, yeah, that it depends on how we look for that, and then we cross the borders, right? And I think that what the different papers are showing is that in many ways we are crossing the line, right? Like for example, if you take the west of Pará, this around, for example, Carajás, here, like I mean, for sure we pass beyond the any tipping point locally. What I don't think we know is if the whole system is close to collapse or not. I don't know, and we have to have people to answer that. But what we are seeing is just the amount of water that is circulating, which is we can measure by the rain, etc. It's dropping, not just here, because it's dropping also in Peru and Colombia and so on, right? So this is something. So I hope the forest is very resilient to that, but kind of if we look at like the processes that we are seeing, for example, we have this staggering number. We are measuring on Mapioma's water, we are measuring the water surface, right? And then we differentiate the natural water streams from the artificial water bodies, like reservoirs and things like this. So we map about 800,000 water bodies, or artificial water bodies, right? Or that's like reservoirs in farms, for irrigation, or for mining, or etc., energy and so on. And only about 20% of that have a registration. It exists officially. So it means like 80% of the reservoirs in Brazil, although it's a requirement, if you have a reservoir, it should be known by the different authorities to regulate the use of water, they're non-existent, right? And one other place where we see this thing growing very fast is in the borders of the Amazon and Cerrado. Really where you have like this yellow, the biggest yellow part here. And so for me, this is a sign that why you make a reservoir in a farm, right? Because it's an expensive thing to do. You do it because there's no sufficient rain, right? So it's like, oh, there's no water, make a reservoir. And then you make the reservoir. And these are, by the way, upstream, because the waters in the Amazon goes from this side inside the Amazon. So you make a reservoir, there is less water going to the natural water stream, less water in the water stream where you have the forest, you have less water to be pumped. The whole thing is like looks like a machine that is running on the opposite direction that it should be. So yeah, so I don't know. My sense is that we are really in a bad shape in this case. That is not like, I'm not sure by looking at that if we just stop deforestation, it's sufficient anymore.
Exactly.
That's the point. Like some years ago, we said I would say this. I think 5 years ago, I was saying like, if we just stop deforestation, just because the forest is just regrowing, just leave the nature to do whatever is the job, will be sufficient. But I think maybe we're talking about something else that has to be done specifically in terms of repairing on specific places that are important and so on locally.
We want to hear from Marina, but we want to collect a first round of questions. Okay, so let's try to exercise the art of condensation, right? So we can give a wonderful bundle of questions to Tasso. So Christian, Adriana, Carlos, yes, and Jacob. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. There was a lot of interesting themes, topics that you brought up, but I was interested in, or I was struck by the statistic that only 1% of the deforestation happens on indigenous people's lands, right? Very interesting, but there was a proposition or suggestion that if you consolidate, correct me if I'm wrong, if I remember correctly, consolidating protected areas and indigenous people's lands, right? That could maybe bring a benefit. Was that the suggestion? That would bring a benefit because of the type of management that's occurring on these lands that uh, moves away from deforestation. But I couldn't help but wonder of potential unintended consequences of that, given how you define a protected area, how you define indigenous people's land. So it's just thinking about potential unintended consequences, mostly for the people, right, and their social cultural systems, politics, etc. I was just thinking about that, the feasibility and what could
For
actually
example,
happen.
give me one example.
Okay. We want to collect a few
No,
more
just to
questions.
understand
Okay,
the
yes,
question,
sure.
like
Okay.
what could be one,
Okay.
Unintended consequences, I mean, potential impact on governance. I mean, if it's protected area, who's managing that protected area? The government to an extent, and then if indigenous people have certain rights, would those rights change? Would the governance system change? How could that affect them, right, under new political structures, for example? Just thinking about those potential unintended consequences.
Yeah, Adriana? Yes?
Yeah, thank you. So Marina, I wanted to ask you about those mechanisms of systemic collapse. And for Tasso, like, where do you see those mechanisms? Do you see them within the Amazon, or are there related tipping points across these biomes? Like the Pantanal, the dramatic drop in water there, is that a reflection of something crossed in the Amazon? So how do we read these systemic collapses through the different biomes and their relationship to each other? Like, can we see something outside the Amazon that we can't see from the inside, kind of thing? Yeah.
So we had here on this side, we had Maria Fleury, who actually we are so proud of your work and partnership with Mapiomas. Right, you won a wonderful award by working with materials of Mapiomas. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, Tasso. I'm curious how you go from, like, you were talking about like stationary emissions, and Mapiomas maps like the deforestation that's happening so quickly in Brazil. So how do you keep track of like the emissions that are changing so fast?
Carlos, yeah.
Just a brief question, Tasso, in terms of representativeness. You have been talking about Brazilian Amazon, which represents 61% of the whole biome. How would you integrate, the rest of Amazonia, like 39% that is outside the borders of Brazil?
And then we had Jacob.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was lovely. I wanted to pick up on the question of land use quickly, because that brings in a spatial dimension, which I found very interesting. You mentioned that cities are only like 0.5% of the land use, right? So looking at the maps and all this visual data is fascinating because it's like, okay, cities don't matter that much. But then I was thinking about what's just happening in New York, or like where the UN summit is happening, or when you think about financial centers, and you mentioned that point of like finance has such an outsized impact on what's happening, and like kind of governing. And so I'm wondering how to deal with that kind of like, there's almost a mismatch, like I see some kind of accountability mismatch between cities as not playing any role in land use, but then having this extremely important role as centers of decision making. And how can we deal with that? And also, like, maybe from your practical experience, as I think it's also like a bit of a disciplinary perspective, maybe as a natural scientist, as a social scientist. And there's a lot of questions in that, but just bringing the cities as decision centers. Thank you.
2 minutes. Arthur's condensation for you too. Just kidding.
No, sure.
No, we're not finished. We're good. We have time.
Yeah,
Round.
I'm trying to think about like as you were speaking about this potentially unintended consequences, unwanted consequences of the assignment, right, of the land for protection and indigenous communities, could be quilombolas also and others. Honestly, I can't imagine the negative one. That's very practical. I say, what could be the negative one? Because basically, it's recognized rights. In the case of indigenous lands, it's recognized rights. Like this, people just have the right, and then you have to recognize the rights. And usually, just by the way they related to the forest and the land, it leads to the protection. It's just by the fact that it's how they. It's difficult to explain. It's how they relate to the forest. It's like it's not an utility as it is for all of us in a sense. So I'm trying to think on any case that would be like, okay, we assigned the land for indigenous land, and then it had a negative impact in terms of protection.
No, more like restrictions, potential restrictions added, right? They already have potentially sustainable management systems. But when you designate it as a protected area based on like government definition, I wonder if like there could be more restrictions added to the people that they were already doing it okay. Why not leave it as is?
Yeah, because I think when you have people living there, and if it's indigenous people or local communities, basically there is three ways in which you give the destiny of the land. One, if it's indigenous lands, it stays as public land, but they are the only ones with the right to use the land. And so that's cool. There is no restriction that applies to them. Even, for example, if they want to plant soybean, actually it's possible, right? But it doesn't happen because that's not their thing. But it's basically this thing. The second one is quilombola. The quilombola is different because the quilombola, they actually receive a title, and this title is a collective title, so they can't sell, but it's private land from that community. And again, what we have seen is the same thing. Is like they want to have the right to continue on their land, and if you look at the history of the use of the land on those quilombola areas, they have this record that the intensity of the management that they do on the land, it's very low in terms of open new areas and so on. So I would say this is safe also. And the last one is people that live on areas that forests, which we call extractivists or things like this. So bad word in English, like extractivist, but basically. If you want to create a protected area in this case, it will be one of those three categories. RESEX, is Extractivist Reserve, RDS, which is Reserve of the Sustainable Development, or National Forest. And so if it's the first two, they are the ones managing the land. So they will take the decisions together with the Park Service. Usually they are dying to have this type of definition because then the people that are outside can't get into the land. So but there are cases in which you have potentially some dispute on how to use the land, specifically on national forests. But I don't remember of any national forest created after 2005 that would have this type of situation. Normally, where you have people, they say, okay, this part, extractivist reserve or RDS, this part that you don't have the people, national forest. The place where you have people in national forests normally are the areas that were created before. Because the reason why you created national forests in the beginning, like in the 80s and 90s, was to protect mining. That's the reason why we have like Floresta Nacional do Carajás, that we have Floresta Rio Norte. That these are national forests that were created to protect the mining. And then, and now it's sell like, oh, the mining is protecting the forest. No, actually, this was created to protect the mining, because this was all public companies. Pantanal and the Amazon. Marina will answer that, but I think the best way to explain the change in the Amazon is actually to what happened outside the Amazon. Because even if when you talk about the drought, it's so distant from the people, and then I come back to the urban area. Like decision making in Brazil is done by people living in cities. Like it's 87% of our population, I think, something like this. It's living in cities. It's one of the most urban countries for sure in the region, right? So so I think we can see this outside. I think Pantanal is one case. All the examples that I show here, I think has some relationship. Still to see like I would like to see like a paper to just try to explain this specifically. So, okay, what's the relationship? That's a request.
Homework from
You know?
Marina. Okay.
Please
But tomorrow.
give me with all the numbers and et cetera, what is the relationship between the drought in Pantanal and the, what's happening in the Amazon? That would be like something. We have all the signs that this is happening, but we should have to make the connections. I think it's the best way to explain to people why it's important to protect the Amazon. Is just say like, look, the drought in São Paulo has a relationship with that. If you talk with a taxi driver in São Paulo, or Uber, right? It's not taxi anymore. Uber, he will know the flying rivers. Oh yeah, the flying rivers, and we have this drought in São Paulo because they are cutting down the Amazon. That's the whole connection that they can make, and so on. And I think it talks to what you were saying about the role of the city. So what I'm saying here is that in terms of land use, it's not really a big issue. It's a big issue, for example, in Europe, and it's a big issue in certain parts of US, that conversion, the urbanization is actually a threat to natural environments in many places. In Brazil, in terms of area, there is no meaning. No meaning. Even mining like is growing, but in terms of area, no meaning. The problem with gold mining is the contamination of water and the consequence, the social consequence for indigenous people. And the other, that's the big thing. How to keep. Do you want to talk about this first, and then because I will shift just talk about the
You think we have time?
system.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Then I'll come back to your question.
Okay, so trying to be brief, Adriana. But the thing is that I would say the flying rivers is one of the connections we know for the entire Amazon in terms of the systemic collapse. So what happens in northeastern Amazon, eastern Amazon can propagate downstream through the moisture flux to the provision of water for plants in southwestern Amazon. So what happens in eastern Amazon can influence what happens in western Amazon, even though southwestern Amazon has not been deforested yet. So this is one mechanism we know for a systemic dieback. So it's not only evapotranspiration and then clouds, rainfall in the local scale, but also downstream, the eastern wind flux, right? So this is one for a systemic dieback. And this can influence the hydrological and the carbon global cycle through teleconnections we have all over the planet, in the tropics and in the extratropics. This is one thing. This is huge, right? But if we talk about tipping points in the local scale, I think for me it's very much related to the hidden mechanisms we still don't know. Because the connections, we have the flying rivers, but we do have like proper rivers and like groundwater, and we don't understand this world. So most of the Cerrado provision, water provision to the Amazon is not even cited. And southern and southeastern Amazon is very much fed by water springs from the Cerrado, and people don't really know that. And these water springs are ceasing just because we are deforesting the Cerrado, right? So droughts can also be seen as coming from the Cerrado. And we are deforested more, we have deforested almost 50% of the Cerrado right now. So I think quantifying this in a very integrated and comprehensive way is key. So we have to leave the carbon agenda, which is very important, as Tasso mentioned, and we already know a lot. But in terms of water and food security, we still don't understand anything just because we don't understand the mechanisms behind what is going on in the water flow below ground. I would say mostly below ground, because from the sky and the flux, we do have an okay understanding. The below ground, the heterogeneity within the forests are very important. And we have to remember that there are people living in the Amazon, right? So even if 1 pixel of this crosses a threshold or a critical threshold, a tipping point or something else, they will suffer. So this is something we see just as a pixel, but people, they're resistance, right? So they have to struggle a lot. So I think we have to take into account heterogeneity in the processes, in the mechanisms, and in the people affected and impacted by what is going to happen in future.
That's the second paper.
I'm taking notes.
No, because I think this thing also this thing like what's the influence of Cerrado in the dynamics
Yeah,
of
this
water
is what in this is in our notebook already. Yeah.
He's working with Elena, friend Elena.
Yeah.
The world without the Amazon now. How to think of the Amazon without the Cerrado.
That's an interesting one. Huh? How to have the Amazon without the Cerrado.
And I just want to say
How
something.
Cerrado destroyed the Amazon?
So you have a good time.
That's a perverse thinking of the oil, right? That you said.
Yeah. But I want to say just one other thing, because you said about the flying rivers and quantify this, right? So this has only been in the media in Brazil. So Fantástico is a show that people have, like, and like millions of people watch this. And they talked about flying rivers in Fantástico, and people all over the place, they know it. But they say it influences southeastern Brazil, but we don't really have a peer-reviewed paper with this data because the authors never succeeded in publishing this because it's very contradictory, So, La Plata Basin, so Argentina and Iguazu waterfalls, yes, very much. Pantanal, very much. This has been a little bit quantified in a scientific perspective, but not for public policy, I would say. It's not translated yet. But for southeastern Brazil, it can be part of the problem, but not entirely the problem. I would say the Cerrado plays a more important role for southeastern Brazil in terms of water provision below ground than the Amazon. But this is just a hypothesis. I have to test that. But it's just something that we've been discussing because we don't have a paper for this, It's just like
well, the thing that I was capturing on this, especially when Paulo Tasso was explaining, is that it's not much that in the case of São Paulo, for example, that was showing, it's not much that the rain will come from the Amazon, but it's the fact that the force that you have with the movements of the in the Amazon needs to be very strong to move the mass of dry, hot air that is in São Paulo. It don't move until you have a strong force there, and it's this that I was just repeating, right? So it's like this force when it kind of it's like if you are taking the cork of the
champagne.
So you need this to be, and once it pours out, then the humidity from the south can go up, and that's why that would explain why you are having this totally crazy stuff. Like you have too much rain in the south and dry in São Paulo, and that's because you couldn't take the cork out. Once you have the cork out, then this humidity don't stop till in Rio Grande do Sul and can move.
Exactly, it's a block.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have still
That's
Carlos'
my poor
question.
understanding of a forester, like
Yes.
forester trying to explain.
So Carlos, Tasso, just try to wrap it up. We have a question from Carlos too, right? How the
Did already ask it. I mean, it's about the
I think there is
61%, the rest.
Maria's question.
Maria's question.
Yeah, and-
Yes, good.
Yeah, for the whole Amazon, like the whole thing of the whole Amazon, like including the 61%. There is a lot of data that we also produce on land use for the whole Amazon. Actually, Mapiomas now is in all countries in South America. So you have like Mapiomas Peru, for example, with all the data in Peru and so on. And there is now for 5 years now we have the Mapiomas for the whole Amazon. So we have glaciers, for example, that we don't have in Brazil, but we have in the maps because glaciers, we lose 50% of the glaciers, right?
Yeah.
In 30 years, which is striking. Now, so just say that there is a lot of things there, but I think the interesting thing for those interested on the whole thing about the Amazon is to read, or at least read the summary of the scientific panel for the Amazon, which has a lot of interesting things there. A lot of questions right at the end. There is a lot of questions also. Talking about the mission. No, it's although it's not stationary, which would be the thing about stationary emissions that basically it stopped there, and then you were just like counting how much fuel gets into the machine. You know how much the machine is emitting per consumption of fuel, and basically it's very easy, right? That's how it's done. And there is now also direct measurement, right? There is this thing for the methane now, new satellites that you can actually measure the methane emissions from stationary places really directly. Like you just measure the clump, and then you know how much methane is being emitted, even if you don't know the specific technology that is in place. This is things that are plain. In the case of like land use change, there is two ways to do this in large scale. The first one is direct measurement. So you don't care about what is the land use change. You basically estimate the amount of a biomass that you have in a certain point, and there is several ways in which you can do it by remote sensing. There is many things that will be estimations and so on. You need a base map a baseline map to do it, but it's something that we know how to do it, and so it's just a question of defining, fine-tuning, and agree between everybody what will be the baseline, how to do the baseline. But you can do direct measurement. There is many people now thinking that this would be the easiest way to go. Like forget about deforestation or measuring degradation and so on. Basically, you just directly measure the amount of biomass you have, estimate this biomass, and done, you go, right? The problem with that is that the scale in which you can do that, it's not that, but you can do this pixel by pixel. You can have a good estimation, but you will not have like a sufficient good estimation to make like a estimation of the emissions that will be sufficiently good in terms of the variations, because it's like you would need like 3D information because the biomass is depends on the height, etc. But it's possible. The second way to do it is basically measure the land use change, and then you have based on measurements that were done on different use of the land, you can. So, for example, if it's a forest of a certain type, then you have someone that make a measurement of all the trees and calculate how much tons of carbon you have on each hectare of different types of land use. And then basically what you do is to measure how much each pixel, what's the land use on time 0 and what's the land use on time 1. And then you say, oh, this land use for this pixel would have this amount of carbon, and this land use will have this amount of carbon. And then you say, what's the variation? It's go up or go down. That's how it's done, the inventories today, the national inventories. The problem is that when you do those national inventories like that, you do on large span of time. So you say, for example, in Brazil, they make like one map, and then 7 years later, they make another map, and then they compare those two maps, right? That's how it's done. So what we do differently is that we do this every year. So every year you have each pixel and have the story of the pixel. So the scientific committee of Papillomas in this last meeting suggests that we should, because they realize that many people are trying to use our data to estimate the emissions by land use change, that there is many misuse of the information because of the understanding of the information. So they challenge us to kind of make a product on Mapiomas, which will be our best estimation of what is the carbon content and different ways in which you can measure the carbon content. And then you know what are the weaknesses and the strengths of the data and how you can use, and then you choose what you want, but knowing what are those limitations.
So Tasso, can I just jump in? And I know that this, I know we are running out of time, but I imagine that I will channel some of the questions or concerns that that are lurking here, which had to do with your final list of the 7 points, and then you said the contractions or the contradictions, right? It is about the complex political system that is underlying this reality that you described, right? So what do you think, not that you have a crystal ball, but what do you think are some of the best possible scenarios, and what would need to happen? Which kind of forces would need to come together to make that leap? And how, but then the other scenario, what's the worst possible scenario? How can the continuous forces of, call it agribusiness or other forces that are being very active actors in performing this data that you showed us of? Not that you have a crystal ball, I'm not asking you to give an X-ray, but I'm just curious, which kind of forces do you think are in place currently and which could be aligned towards a best possible scenario? But also in a cautionary note, what one should be kind of aware of, concerned of, that might also still play a role in a more negative way?
Yeah. So I will start with this. If you make any pool in Brazil about how much people care about forests or the environment or climate change, etc., you get those amazing numbers, like 80% believe in climate change and much better than US. Much better than lots of European countries. Like the level of, supposedly the level of, understanding or empathy or, I don't know, or linkage with the question that we have, climate change and so on. It's there. The problem is, this is like the collective perception of the people that live in the city, talking about the problem that seems distant, right? The thing is that when you go to the Congress, for example, the representation that you have there don't reflect it. And so, it reflects specific interests on decisions that will be taken in terms of the use of the land. So I think this all comes to, kind of, if you have summarized, is that the decision of an individual is based on his immediate interests, not in the collective benefit, right? And so it makes sense in many cases that you take the decision that is not the best for everyone, because you will just take the decision for yourself on the short run. And you have to elaborate a lot to kind of, let's say, you are clear-cutting forests in the edge of the Amazon, and you know that the consequence in 20, 15 years is that you will not be able to produce the same way you're producing today, right? But you were there, you have this piece of land, you have to, you want to take a value on this piece of land, and then, if I clear cut the forest now, then I can sell the forest, the piece of land will be more valuable if you have areas that is open, or I can produce something right now, etc. So the decisions are taken based on your best interests. And if there is one place where the sum of the individual interests is not equal to the benefit for the interest of the the collectivity is the management of natural resources, and specifically in the case of the forest. It's quite the opposite. So there is this big tension in Brazil. I think it's elsewhere, but I think in Brazil, in the Amazon, it's all of that. This whole debate about this, the indigenous land and the marco temporal, which is actually being voted today, right, as we speak.
Yeah.
The whole debate is about the right, the individual rights, right? The private, as a private owner, your rights, and etc. So I think that's the tension. The tension is the collective interests, which should be the main role of the government. The government should be thinking about collectively what is important in terms of for the best in the future, etc. It's not. It's captured by the specific interests of groups or individuals with this rationale that you have to have the best, everyone taking the best decision for yourself. So that's what makes people, for example, wanting to not have regulation on many things or too easy regulation on many things. And there's no way we will be able to maintain the cohesion of the Amazon or the goal of zero deforestation. That's if it's not by regulation and or at least common agreement that collectively we will have to go in a certain direction, even if this has setbacks for the your individual decision making. So I think that what many people in this agenda is thinking right now is several mechanisms for compensation. Those mechanisms of compensation will be unfair.
Yeah.
No matter what calculation you make, any compensation will at the end be unfair because who will get more compensation? The ones that had more land, more resources, etc. Which is very contradictory, right? You give more, but maybe this will have to happen. For example, it's very likely. I don't know how is the voting. Somebody's following, but
Yeah,
it's
Toffoli has just.
Toffoli voted
yeah,
against.
so at the end, probably what will happen. I'm just guessing, right? Very difficult. That's when the things are happening, but probably what will happen, the kind of the solution that we will have, like, okay, there was no marco temporal, so there was no date, but
there is the
they would talk about like compensation,
Alexandre
which
de
is
Moraes
something that
thesis.
which doesn't exist today, but that will be a kind of, a mechanism. And maybe to have like a more like peaceful solution, maybe that is what we have to do. And then, it's kind of funny, but for the compensation, we need a marco temporal. It's kind of crazy, right? But that's what you need. Like, so, okay, but if you have a compensation,
And the
then we
idea-
have to use the criteria of the
And
marco
the idea of boa fé, which is another.
Yeah.
It's a tough one.
It is a tough one. Even to
But I would say
translate.
that I think this is
Good
our
faith.
biggest challenge is this thing about like how we manage this in a very unequal country to manage the individual interests, which could be legitimate, right? You can explain this in a legitimate way against the collective interests.
And I think I don't want to monopolize, but this is so helpful, Tasso, to think these terms that you're thinking. I was just thinking then translating it to the executive, right? Where the executive is supposed to stand for a collective of sorts, because there are a few things from what you presented that's could be an executive decision, right? Declaration of the public lands, for example. So that's where the complex
But
political system.
This case, for example, is a very interesting one, right? It's recording, but anyway. But think like this, how we actually managed to have the creation of these protected areas in Pará, in the Calha Norte. See, Beto will tell the story. Like, basically, at the end, this was like on a collective interest, right? But the way we actually managed to create this was to capture the interests of one person,
The governor.
the governor. So it was an individual, it was his interest, but say like, look, you are the only one, every time I say this, I get goosebumps, because you are the only one that can create those areas. You are the last one, because if we don't do it right now, nobody will be able to do it. Many others will be able to undo what you did. But the only one that will be able, the whole world, to create 5-6 million hectares of protected areas at once, is you. That's your legacy. Because nobody will remember him because he put the accounts of the state in the right place. Then nobody cares about that, right? The only thing people remember about him is that the creation of the largest protected areas in the world. So that was it. Like 5 days or 10 days before leaving the office, sign the paper and create this whole thing. And it's still there, right? So it's crazy, but it's like, that was the public interest. But at the end, the decision was based on the interest of one person. Because he could like have that as a legacy. So, and the contradiction of that is that, like take Rondônia, for example, right? In Rondônia, we had all these protected areas that was very important to keep. Like you see, Rondônia, this is the state of Rondônia. All of that, indigenous lands, Uruguay, etc., and protected areas. All of that, indigenous lands, protected areas. All of that, all of that, all of that. Here also we had some protected areas. That was state protected, right? What happened? The people started to invade those lands, and then the Câmara Legislativa,
The legislature.
the state Congress, let's say, they approve the uncreation, like I said, I don't know, the uncreation of the protected areas. So imagine, so that was the collective, like this was representing collectively. So they basically undo this thing because of the interests of those people that invaded land. So again, I think this is always a battle between what is in the interest of the public in general and what is the individual interests and how you move them into the different spheres. I don't have a solution for that. I just think that there's, but the things I'm trying to elaborate when we do those plans now is to think about simple mechanisms that you don't have to think too much in terms of doing. So the last thing I'm doing now is thinking to have a global mechanism in which we pay for each hectare that is maintained as forest, no matter what is your past and doesn't matter what is your future. Just look at to the present. So it can be a decision for someone, some individual can take the decision based on the present and not kind of elaborating too much on the future and the past. And so, okay, if you keep the forest, $30 per hectare.
It's a sort of carbon credits.
No credits, no carbon, nothing like that. I don't care about the carbon or the biodiversity. Just say you keep the forest, $30 per hectare. You cut down the forest, I discount 100 hectares. So the disincentive is $3,000. Simple as that. You just have to take a decision in a simple way. If you don't do anything, $30. If you do something, you lose potentially to receive this thing. And not discussing how much carbon you have or how much the biodiversity and calculating price of things and etc., which makes like things confusing.
And a lot of greenwashing.
Yeah,
A lot of greenwashing.
Yeah, the idea with that is to create some kind of mechanism that makes that translate the collective interests, which is like we will use money that belongs to everyone to create an incentive that will go at the end. We will end up going to individuals, but with the collective impact of protecting the forest. Sometimes, so I'm just using this as an example, but I'm saying we have always to think about this type of mechanisms where we can simplify the decision making and not being too complex of thinking what is your interest on the long run and short run.
What a fascinating play of scales here that we had, from this complex tipping point systems, queering the regions a little bit, what goes in, what comes out. But
every
also,
time I say this, people are, but where the money will come from, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we have 1 billion hectares of tropical forests. If there's zero deforestation, we end the deforestation next year, right? We need $30 billion per year, right? It's a lot of money. Well, it happens the last year, just by chance. There's nothing to do with the number I proposed, $30. But it happens
It's a coincidence.
that last year we produced 30 billion barrels of oil.
So
It's $1 per barrel. It's the variation of the price of the barrel in 3-4 hours. But that is what it takes to give $1, like $30 per hectare to maintain the tropical forest, which actually keeps the temperature 1 degree below. If you take out the tropical forest, the temperature will increase about 1 degree.
But then,
So-
then a system that can control the fact that it is being or not deforested for each pixel.
Yeah, which is very easy.
Okay.
No, I mean, technically, that's why I'm not counting carbon and things like this, because just to see if there is a forest or not, it's very easy. But if you try to say, oh, but there is a degradation or no degradation, is there a amount of carbon? It's like, then you complicate everything, and it's. The other thing is like, is this worth? And then I just give this as the last piece that I love. This part is like, but it's $30 is sufficient to pay for the service or something like this. And I say, well, let's just talk about like paying for service. If you take like there is all these numbers estimating that we have about 20 billion tons of water being evaporated in the Amazon every day, right? 20 billion tons. If you need to use energy to make the same service for the forest, you need 6 months of the entire power capacity of the planet to do the work of 1 day of the forest. How much that? $1 trillion. Because it's the value of the 6 months of the energy of the planet. $1 trillion per day, $360 trillion per year, right? That's the value of the forest for one service. Well, it happens that the global GDP is $120, $130 trillion. So that information is absolutely useless. It's just to show that it's completely absurd. Like, there's no meaning. Like, try to calculate the value of those things is like, it's just useless. Then you keep like, how much carbon is. So the idea of having just like something very simple that it's very easy to measure, like there is a forest, there's no forest. Actually, if there's no forest and at the end of the year you have forest, you also get money, right? Because you are regenerating.
So we want that. We want that. We want
Let's go
forest
for it.
standing and more forests. So thank you, Tasso. Thank you.